The sun rose over Wichita, Kansas on June 3, 1921, just like it had every morning before. But this particular Friday would mark a turning point in American history that nobody could have predicted. On this day, two men would open a tiny restaurant that would fundamentally transform how humanity eats, how businesses operate, and how American culture would spread across the globe. The city was still waking up. Factory workers were beginning their shifts at the Coleman Lamp Company and the Cessna Aircraft Corporation. Farmers were bringing their produce to market. The streets were a mixture of horse-drawn wagons and the increasingly common automobiles, Ford Model Ts mostly, affordable enough now that working-class families could aspire to own one. At the corner of Main Street and Douglas Avenue, a small white building stood ready to open its doors. It was unlike anything Wichita, or America, had ever seen. The structure gleamed in the morning light, its white porcelain enamel steel panels pristine and modern. But what made it truly distinctive were the architectural flourishes. Small turrets at the corners, crenellated battlements along the roofline, reminiscent of a medieval castle. Inside, Walter Anderson was already at work. He had been there since before dawn, preparing the griddle, slicing onions, organizing buns, and ensuring every surface was spotless. Anderson was a perfectionist, a cook who had spent the last 5 years obsessing over a single question. How do you make the perfect hamburger? Beside him stood Edgar Waldo Billy Ingram, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. Ingram was the businessman, the marketing genius, the man who understood that success wasn't just about making good food, it was about creating trust, building a brand, and establishing a system that could be replicated. Together, these two men were about to open White Castle, the world's first fast food hamburger chain. They didn't use that term, of course. Fast food wouldn't enter the American lexicon for decades. They were simply trying to solve what seemed like a simple problem: selling hamburgers that people would actually trust enough to eat. They had no idea they were about to change the world. The disgusting reputation. To understand why White Castle was revolutionary, you need to understand just how terrible hamburgers were in 1921. Today, we think of hamburgers as quintessentially American, as wholesome as baseball and apple pie. But in the early 20th century, hamburgers were associated with everything disgusting and dangerous. The hamburger had arrived in America sometime in the late 1800s, probably brought by German immigrants who had eaten something similar in Hamburg. The concept was simple: ground beef, formed into a patty, cooked quickly, and served on bread. It was cheap, filling, and could be prepared rapidly. But that's where the appeal ended. Most hamburgers in 1921 were sold by street vendors operating from pushcarts or tiny wooden stands. These operations were rarely clean. Vendors would grind meat of questionable origin, often scraps and trimmings that butchers couldn't sell as proper cuts. The meat might have been sitting unrefrigerated for hours or even days. Flies would land on it. Dust from the street would settle on it. The cooking process wasn't much better. Griddles were rarely cleaned. The same spatula that had been touching raw meat would touch cooked meat. Cross-contamination was rampant. Food poisoning was common. People got sick all the time from eating hamburgers. Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel, The Jungle, had exposed the horrifying conditions in America's meatpacking industry. The public learned about rats being ground into sausage, workers with tuberculosis coughing over meat, and floors covered in blood and filth. Although the novel led to reforms, it also created deep suspicion about any food made from ground meat. Respectable middle-class families warned their children away from hamburger stands. Eating a hamburger was something you did if you were poor, desperate, or reckless. It was food for transient workers, sailors on shore leave, and people with nothing to lose. Newspapers regularly ran stories about hamburger-related food poisoning. Doctors advised against eating ground meat from street vendors. The hamburger was widely considered dangerous, possibly deadly, and certainly lower class. This was the environment Walter Anderson entered when he decided to make hamburgers his business. Walter Anderson's obsession. Walter Anderson was born in 1880 and had spent most of his adult life working in kitchens. He had cooked in restaurants, worked in cafeterias, and run his own small operations. But somewhere along the way, he became fascinated by the hamburger. Anderson saw what others missed. The hamburger's problems weren't inherent to the food itself. They were problems of preparation, handling, and presentation. A hamburger made from fresh, quality beef, cooked properly on a clean griddle, and served immediately could be delicious. More importantly, it could be safe. Around 1916, Anderson opened a small hamburger stand in Wichita. It wasn't much, just a converted streetcar with a griddle inside. But Anderson ran it differently than anyone else. First, he insisted on fresh beef. He developed relationships with local butchers and paid more for quality cuts. He ground the meat himself, daily, so he knew exactly what was going into it. Second, he revolutionized the cooking method. Instead of forming thick patties that took forever to cook and might stay raw in the middle, Anderson flattened the beef into thin patties. He pressed them down on a hot griddle with a spatula. This had multiple benefits. The meat cooked quickly and evenly, developed a flavorful crust, and customers could see it cooking thoroughly. Third, and this was genius, Anderson added onions directly to the griddle, placing the beef patty on top of them. As the meat cooked, the onions would steam, cooking the patty from below while the griddle cooked it from below. The onion flavor penetrated the meat, creating a distinctive taste. Fourth, Anderson made cleanliness visible. He wore a clean white apron. He kept his griddle spotless. He washed his hands constantly. Customers could watch everything he did. There were no secrets, no hidden preparation areas where who knows what might be happening. Fifth, he used fresh buns from a local bakery, delivered daily. The buns were soft and slightly sweet, providing the perfect complement to the savory, onion-infused beef. The result was a hamburger unlike anything else available. It was small, just a few ounces of meat, but it was perfectly cooked, flavorful, and most importantly, trustworthy. Customers could see it being prepared. They knew it was fresh. They could watch Anderson's clean, methodical process. Anderson's stand became popular, but he lacked the capital to expand. He was a cook, not a businessman. He could make great hamburgers, but he didn't know how to build a brand, manage finances, or create a scalable system. That's where Billy Ingram came in. Billy Ingram's vision. Edgar Waldo Ingram, everyone called him Billy, was born in 1880, the same year as Anderson. But his path had been entirely different. Ingram had worked in insurance and real estate. He understood contracts, marketing, and finance. He knew how to read markets and identify opportunities. In 1920, Ingram encountered Anderson's hamburger stand. He was immediately impressed by the product, but even more impressed by the potential. Ingram understood something profound. Americans were changing. The country was urbanizing rapidly. More people worked in factories and offices, living by the clock, with limited time for meals. Automobiles were becoming common, creating a mobile population. What these people needed was food that was quick, cheap, reliable, and didn't require sitting down in a restaurant for an hour. They needed food they could trust, food they could eat in minutes, food that cost pennies. The hamburger could be that food, if someone could solve the trust problem. Ingram approached Anderson with a proposal: partnership. Anderson would handle the cooking and operations. Ingram would handle the business, marketing, and expansion. Together, they would create something entirely new. A chain of hamburger restaurants built on a system of absolute consistency, cleanliness, and quality. But Ingram insisted on one non-negotiable element. The restaurants had to look permanent and trustworthy. No wooden shacks. No push carts. No temporary-looking structures that might disappear overnight, taking customers' money with them. The restaurants had to look like fortresses. The birth of White Castle. The name came first. Ingram spent weeks considering options. He wanted something that communicated two essential qualities: purity and permanence. White was perfect for purity. White represented cleanliness, sterility, hospitals, and hygiene. White was the opposite of the grimy, suspicious hamburger stands everyone knew. But White what? White Hut. Too temporary. White House. Too presumptuous, and potentially legally problematic. White Palace. Too fancy for a 5-cent hamburger. Then Ingram hit on it: Castle. Castles were permanent. Castles were strong. Castles protected what was inside. Castles lasted for centuries. A castle wasn't going anywhere. White Castle communicated everything Ingram wanted. This is clean. This is solid. This is trustworthy. This will be here tomorrow and next year. The architectural design followed the name. Ingram hired a designer to create a building that actually looked like a miniature castle. It would be covered in white porcelain enamel steel panels, a modern, easy-to-clean material that would gleam in the sunlight. The building would feature corner turrets and crenellated battlements along the roofline, just like a medieval castle. The design served multiple purposes. It was eye-catching and memorable. Drivers could spot it from blocks away. It communicated permanence and stability. It was easy to clean, reinforcing the message of hygiene. And it was distinctive enough to become a brand identifier. You could be anywhere in America, see that white building with turrets, and know exactly what you were getting. Inside, every element was designed around two principles: speed and cleanliness. The kitchen was completely open and visible to customers. There were no walls separating the cooking area from the counter. Customers could watch their hamburgers being prepared. They could see the gleaming griddle, watch Anderson's methodical process, observe the fresh ingredients. The cooking process itself became a performance. Anderson would take a ball of fresh ground beef, place it on the griddle atop a bed of sliced onions, and press it flat with a spatula. As it cooked, he would use a knife to punch 5 holes through the patty. These holes served multiple purposes. They allowed the patty to cook faster and more evenly, they created more surface area for the flavorful crust to develop, and they let the onion steam penetrate the meat. The entire process took less than 2 minutes. The cooked patty would be placed on a fresh bun, and the hamburger would be handed to the customer. No plates. No silverware. No sitting down. You got your hamburger in a paper wrapper, ate it standing at a narrow counter or took it with you, and you were done. The price was set at 5 cents per hamburger. In 1921, a nickel was real money, enough to buy a newspaper or a loaf of bread, but it was affordable for almost anyone. A factory worker could buy lunch for a dime or 15 cents. A family could feed itself for less than $1. The business model wasn't about high margins. A nickel hamburger probably cost 3 cents to make, leaving only 2 cents profit. But if you sold 1,000 hamburgers a day, that was $20 in profit. Serious money in 1921. The key was volume. Make them fast, sell them cheap, and sell thousands of them. On June 3, 1921, the first White Castle opened its doors in Wichita, Kansas. The first day. Nobody knew what to expect. Anderson and Ingram had advertised in the local newspaper, but would people come? Would they trust this new place enough to try it? The first customers trickled in around lunchtime. Factory workers, mostly, willing to risk a nickel on curiosity. They watched Anderson cook their hamburgers, saw the clean process, and took their first bites. The response was immediate. These weren't the greasy, suspicious hamburgers from street carts. These were genuinely good. The meat was fresh and flavorful. The onions added a sweet, savory complexity. The bun was soft. And most importantly, customers could see that everything was clean and fresh. Word spread quickly in working-class neighborhoods. By the end of the first week, White Castle was busy every lunch hour. By the end of the first month, there were lines. Anderson and Ingram had proven the concept. If you made hamburgers well, kept everything clean and visible, and priced them affordably, people would buy them in large quantities. But this was just one restaurant. Could the system be replicated? Part 2. Building the Empire, 1921 to 1926. The System of Standardization. Ingram understood that success at one location meant nothing unless it could be replicated perfectly at every location. The White Castle in Omaha had to be identical to the White Castle in Wichita. A customer had to know exactly what they were getting, regardless of which restaurant they visited. This was a radical concept in 1921. Most restaurants were unique. Each had its own recipes, its own style, its own quality level. Variation was expected. You might love a restaurant in your hometown, but if you traveled to another city, you had no idea what you'd get. Ingram wanted to eliminate variation entirely. Every White Castle would be identical. Same building, same menu, same cooking process, same taste, same price. To achieve this, everything had to be standardized and documented. The building, Ingram developed detailed architectural plans. Every White Castle would be built from the same components. White porcelain enamel steel panels, same dimensions, same layout, same turrets and battlements. The building became a product itself, manufactured in pieces and assembled on site. The griddle. Anderson designed a specific griddle with exact specifications. It had to maintain a precise temperature, had to be a certain size, had to be positioned at a certain height. The patty. Every hamburger patty had to weigh exactly the same, about 2 ounces. It had to be the same diameter. It had to have exactly 5 holes punched in the same pattern. Anderson created a special spatula with 5 prongs to punch these holes consistently. The onions. They had to be sliced to a specific thickness. Too thick and they wouldn't cook properly. Too thin and they'd burn. A specific quantity of onions went under each patty. The bun. Ingram established relationships with bakeries that could produce buns to exact specifications. The buns had to be a certain size, a certain softness, a certain sweetness. The time. Each hamburger took exactly 2 minutes to cook. Not 1 minute and 50 seconds. Not 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Exactly 2 minutes. Employees were trained to this standard. The cleanliness. Every surface was cleaned constantly. The griddle was scraped after every batch. The counters were wiped down continuously. Employees washed their hands between tasks. The floors were mopped multiple times per day. The white exterior panels were cleaned daily. The uniform. Every employee wore the same uniform. White shirt, white pants, white apron, white cap. No variations. No personal touches. The uniformity communicated professionalism and reinforced the message of cleanliness. This level of standardization was unprecedented. Ingram was essentially applying factory principles to restaurant operations. He was manufacturing hamburgers the way Ford manufactured automobiles. Identical products made through an identical process. The expansion begins. With the system defined and documented, Ingram began expanding. The second White Castle opened in Omaha, Nebraska in 1922. The third opened in Kansas City in 1923. By 1924, White Castle had locations in St. Louis and Louisville. Each new market followed the same pattern. Ingram would identify a location, usually near factories, train stations, or in working-class neighborhoods. He would build the standard White Castle building. He would hire local employees and train them in the precise White Castle method. He would open the doors and let word of mouth do the marketing. The expansion was cautious and deliberate. Ingram didn't open dozens of locations at once. He opened a few, made sure they operated perfectly, then moved to the next market. Quality and consistency mattered more than speed of expansion. Each White Castle location became a local landmark. The distinctive white building with turrets stood out in neighborhoods of brick and wood. The buildings were often placed on corner lots, maximizing visibility. At night, the white panels reflected streetlights, making them glow. The marketing was subtle but effective. Ingram rarely bought large advertisements. Instead, he relied on the building itself as advertising, combined with word of mouth from satisfied customers. He occasionally placed small newspaper ads emphasizing cleanliness and quality, but mostly he let the product speak for itself. And the product did speak. People loved the little hamburgers. They loved the consistency. You could visit any White Castle and get exactly the same experience. They loved the price. 5 cents remained affordable even as the economy fluctuated. They loved the speed, in and out in minutes. Most of all, they loved the taste. Something about those thin patties, cooked on onions, with 5 holes punched through them, created an addictive flavor. The hamburgers were small enough that people often bought them by the half dozen or dozen. The company started selling them in paper sacks, 5, 10, or 20 at a time, for people to take home. The term sliders emerged organically. Nobody is quite sure who coined it first, but it captured something essential about the hamburgers. They were small, easy to eat, and seemed to slide down your throat. You could eat several without feeling overstuffed. The name stuck. By 1926, White Castle had about 20 locations across the Midwest. Revenue was growing steadily. The company was profitable and expanding. Anderson and Ingram had proven that their model worked not just in Wichita, but everywhere they tried it. But success attracts attention. And in 1926, that attention came from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where a businessman named John E. Sachs was paying very close attention to what White Castle was doing. Part 3. The Clone, 1926 to 1930. White Tower emerges. John E. Sachs was a shrewd businessman with an eye for opportunity. In 1926, he noticed something interesting. White Castle's model was working brilliantly, but the company was expanding slowly and hadn't yet entered many major markets. Sachs had a simple idea. Why invent something new when you could copy something that already worked? There was nothing illegal about opening a hamburger restaurant. There was nothing illegal about painting it white. There was nothing illegal about adding turrets to a building. Each individual element of White Castle's operation was, arguably, unprotectable. But what if you copied everything at once? In 1926, Sachs, along with his son Thomas E. Sachs, opened the first White Tower restaurant in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The building was white. It had turrets. It had battlements. It served small square hamburgers for 5 cents. The hamburgers were cooked on a visible griddle with onions. The employees wore white uniforms. The similarities weren't subtle. They were blatant. Even the name followed the same pattern: white, fortress structure. A customer seeing a White Tower for the first time might easily assume it was the same company as White Castle, perhaps with a slightly different name in different regions. And that was exactly the point. Sachs wasn't trying to build a brand from scratch. He was trying to benefit from the brand White Castle had already built. He was free riding on their innovation, their marketing, and their reputation. The first White Tower was successful. Why wouldn't it be? The White Castle model worked, and Sachs was executing it faithfully. Soon, more White Towers appeared in Milwaukee, then in other Wisconsin cities. But Sachs wasn't content with Wisconsin. He began expanding aggressively into markets where White Castle hadn't yet established a presence: Detroit, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, New York City, Boston. White Tower's expansion was faster than White Castle's. While Ingram was being cautious and methodical, ensuring quality at each location, Sachs was moving quickly to grab market share. By 1930, White Tower had nearly as many locations as White Castle, and in some cities, White Tower arrived first, establishing itself before White Castle even knew there was demand in that market. The imitation strategy. White Tower's approach was sophisticated in its shamelessness. They didn't copy everything exactly. That would be too legally vulnerable. Instead, they copied the essence while making minimal changes. Buildings. White Tower buildings were white and had tower-like structures, but the exact architectural details were slightly different. Maybe the turrets were a different shape. Maybe the windows were positioned differently. But from a distance, or at a glance, the buildings looked virtually identical. Name White Tower versus White Castle. Close enough to evoke the same associations: cleanliness, permanence, medieval strength, but different enough to be legally distinct. Hamburgers. White Tower's hamburgers were small and square, cooked on onions, served on soft buns, and sold for 5 cents. But were they cooked for exactly 2 minutes? Did they have exactly 5 holes? Those details might vary slightly. Marketing. White Tower emphasized cleanliness, quality, and affordability. Exactly the same messages White Castle used. But the specific wording of advertisements was different enough to avoid direct copying. The strategy was to stay just on the legal side of acceptable while capturing as much of White Castle's brand value as possible. White Tower wanted customers to think they were getting basically the same thing as White Castle, without White Castle having a clear legal case that they had stolen anything specific. And for customers, White Tower often was basically the same thing. The hamburgers tasted similar. The buildings looked similar. The prices were identical. If you had enjoyed White Castle in Kansas City and then encountered a White Tower in Detroit, you might assume it was the same company or a regional variant. The confusion was profitable for White Tower and infuriating for White Castle. Improvements and variations. To White Tower's credit, they didn't just copy mindlessly. In some ways, they improved on White Castle's model. Larger buildings. Some White Tower locations were bigger than White Castle's, with more seating and more cooking capacity. This allowed them to serve more customers during peak hours. Additional menu items. White Tower experimented with menu additions that White Castle didn't offer initially. Additional breakfast items, different types of sandwiches, milkshakes. Better locations. In some cities, White Tower secured better corner locations or spots with more foot traffic. They were sometimes willing to pay more for premium real estate. Aggressive marketing. While White Castle relied heavily on word of mouth, White Tower sometimes advertised more heavily in newspapers and on billboards, driving awareness more quickly. These improvements made White Tower a legitimate competitor, not just a copycat. In markets where both chains operated, they competed aggressively for customers. And in markets where White Tower arrived first, they established themselves so firmly that White Castle struggled to gain a foothold later. But none of these improvements changed the fundamental fact. White Tower's entire business model was based on copying what White Castle had created. They hadn't pioneered anything. They had simply observed what worked and replicated it. For Billy Ingram, this was infuriating beyond measure. The growing rivalry. By 1928, White Castle and White Tower were engaged in an escalating competition. Both chains were expanding rapidly. Both were profitable. Both were building toward a national presence. But the dynamics were different. White Castle saw itself as the innovator, the pioneer who had taken all the risk and done all the creative work. They had figured out how to make hamburgers respectable when everyone said it couldn't be done. They had invented the entire fast food model. Now someone was stealing the fruits of their labor. White Tower saw itself as a scrappy competitor fighting against an increasingly dominant corporation. They positioned themselves as offering customers more choice, better value, and superior service. They argued that competition was good for consumers and that no company should be allowed to monopolize the hamburger business. The rivalry became personal. Ingram viewed Sachs as a thief. Sachs viewed Ingram as a monopolist trying to suppress legitimate competition. Customers, meanwhile, often didn't care. They liked the hamburgers from both chains. If there was a White Castle nearby, they'd go there. If there was a White Tower instead, that was fine too. The hamburgers were similar enough that most people couldn't tell the difference. This customer indifference was exactly what made White Tower's strategy so effective and so threatening. By making themselves nearly indistinguishable from White Castle, they could capture market share without having to build their own brand from scratch. The decision to sue. By 1930, Billy Ingram had had enough. White Tower wasn't just a competitor, they were a parasite, in his view, living off White Castle's innovation and reputation. Ingram consulted with lawyers. The question was, could White Castle prevent White Tower from copying them? This was uncharted legal territory. Trademark law protected names and logos. Patent law protected specific inventions. But what about the overall look and feel of a business? What about an architectural style? What about a color scheme? What about a business model? The lawyers weren't sure. There were few precedents. But Ingram decided to try. In 1930, White Castle filed a lawsuit against White Tower, alleging trademark infringement and unfair competition. The first burger war was about to go to court. Part 4. The Legal Battle, 1930 to 1938. The unprecedented case. The White Castle versus White Tower lawsuit was unlike anything American courts had dealt with before. It wasn't about a copied patent or a stolen trademark. It was about something more nebulous. The overall image and impression of a business. White Castle's legal team assembled their case around several key arguments. Trade dress. This was a relatively new concept in law. Trade dress referred to the overall appearance of a product or business, its look and feel. White Castle argued that their distinctive White Castle-themed buildings, combined with their emphasis on cleanliness and their specific hamburger style, constituted a protectable trade dress. White Tower, they argued, had copied this trade dress so thoroughly that customers were confused about which company they were patronizing. Architectural copying. White Castle argued that the castle-themed architecture was distinctively theirs. The white color, the turrets, the battlements, these weren't generic architectural elements. They were specific design choices made to create a unique brand identity. White Tower had deliberately copied these elements to benefit from White Castle's brand recognition. Intentional confusion. White Castle presented evidence that customers were genuinely confused between the two chains. They had testimony from people who thought White Tower was White Castle, or vice versa. They had examples of people saying things like, "I went to that White Castle place," when they had actually visited a White Tower. Unfair competition. Beyond trademark law, White Castle invoked the common law doctrine of unfair competition. They argued that White Tower's entire business strategy was to deceive customers into thinking they were getting the White Castle experience. This wasn't legitimate competition. It was commercial parasitism. The case was compelling, but it faced significant challenges. The defense. White Tower's legal defense was equally sophisticated. Functional elements. White Tower argued that many of the elements White Castle wanted to protect were functional, not merely decorative. White buildings were easier to keep clean and made cleanliness visible. Any restaurant focusing on hygiene would naturally choose white. The visible kitchen was a response to public health concerns, not a unique innovation. The small hamburger format was economically sensible. None of these elements were arbitrary design choices that could be owned by one company. Common architectural features. Turrets and battlements weren't invented by White Castle. They were common architectural motifs that had existed for centuries. No company could claim ownership of an architectural style. If White Castle could own castle-themed buildings, then by that logic, one bank could own all neoclassical buildings with columns. Generic terms. White Tower argued that words like white and tower were generic and descriptive. They couldn't be monopolized. Any company could use them. The fact that White Castle had chosen castle didn't mean another company couldn't choose tower. Competition, not confusion. White Tower presented their own witnesses who testified that customers understood they were two different companies. They argued that both chains advertised separately, had different names, and operated independently. The similarity was due to both companies solving the same problems, how to make hamburgers trustworthy, in similar ways, not due to deliberate copying. Public benefit. White Tower argued that allowing White Castle to monopolize the entire hamburger restaurant model would harm consumers. Competition drove innovation, kept prices low, and gave customers choices. If White Castle won this lawsuit, it would effectively mean no one else could open a similar hamburger restaurant anywhere in America. The battles in court. The lawsuit wound its way through the court system for years. It wasn't a single trial but a series of legal skirmishes in different jurisdictions. White Castle would sue White Tower in a particular city, arguing that the White Tower location there was infringing. White Tower would defend, countersue, or file motions to dismiss. The case would drag on for months or years before reaching a conclusion. Different judges reached different conclusions. Some were sympathetic to White Castle's pioneering status and found that White Tower had indeed copied too closely. These judges issued injunctions requiring White Tower to modify their buildings or branding in specific ways. Other judges were sympathetic to White Tower's free competition arguments and ruled that White Castle couldn't own generic elements like color schemes or architectural styles. These judges dismissed White Castle's claims. The inconsistency created a patchwork of legal outcomes. In some cities, White Tower was forced to make modifications. In others, they could continue operating exactly as they had been. Both companies spent enormous amounts of money on legal fees. The lawyers were the only clear winners. The public relations battle. While lawyers fought in courtrooms, both companies fought for public opinion. White Castle emphasized their role as pioneers and innovators. Their advertising reminded customers, "We were the first. Accept no substitutes. Look for the genuine White Castle." They positioned themselves as the authentic choice, the original that others tried to copy. They also emphasized their ongoing innovations. White Castle was continually improving their operations, developing proprietary equipment, and investing in quality. They weren't resting on their laurels, they were innovating. White Tower, meanwhile, positioned themselves as the scrappy underdog fighting against corporate monopoly. Their advertising suggested that White Castle wanted to eliminate competition and control the entire market. They presented themselves as offering customers choice and freedom. They also emphasized their improvements and variations. White Tower wasn't just copying, they were making things better, offering more options, and serving customers in new markets. The public relations battle was, in many ways, more important than the legal battle. Even if White Castle won in court, if consumers preferred White Tower, the legal victory would be hollow. The gradual resolution. The White Castle versus White Tower legal saga never ended with a decisive Supreme Court ruling that settled all questions. Instead, it gradually wound down through a series of settlements and compromises. By the mid-1930s, both companies were exhausted from the legal battles. They had spent years and fortunes on lawyers. Neither had achieved a complete victory. White Castle had won some concessions, but hadn't stopped White Tower from operating. White Tower had survived, but had been forced to make some modifications. Gradually, they reached accommodations. White Tower agreed to make their buildings somewhat more distinct, perhaps using slightly different architectural features or painting elements a different shade. They agreed to make their advertising clearer about being a separate company from White Castle. White Castle, for its part, accepted that they couldn't prevent all competition. They focused instead on protecting specific elements, their name, their specific logo, certain proprietary equipment designs, rather than trying to own the entire concept of a hamburger restaurant. By 1938, most of the major legal battles had been resolved. Both companies continued operating. Both continued expanding. The rivalry continued, but without the intense legal warfare. The courts had established some important principles. Companies could protect their specific trademarks and some aspects of their trade dress, but they couldn't monopolize generic concepts, functional designs, or entire business models. There was a line between legitimate competition and unfair copying, but that line was often blurry and context-dependent. These principles would influence American business law for decades to come. Part 5. The Aftermath and Legacy, 1938 to 1960. Two companies, diverging paths. After the legal battles subsided, White Castle and White Tower continued as competitors, but their paths began to diverge. White Castle remained relatively conservative in its expansion. Billy Ingram continued to prioritize quality and consistency over growth speed. The company opened new locations carefully, ensuring each one met their standards. They remained primarily concentrated in the Midwest and parts of the East Coast. Ingram also invested heavily in vertical integration. White Castle eventually built its own meat processing facilities, its own bakeries, and its own equipment manufacturing. They controlled their entire supply chain, ensuring quality at every step. This made them less vulnerable to supplier problems but also required significant capital investment. White Castle also remained a family business. It wasn't franchised. Every location was company-owned and directly managed. This maintained consistency but limited how fast they could expand. White Tower, meanwhile, expanded more aggressively. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, they had locations throughout the East Coast and Midwest. They were particularly successful in major metropolitan areas like New York, Philadelphia, and Detroit. White Tower was more willing to experiment. They varied their menu more than White Castle, adding new items to appeal to local tastes. They tried different building designs in different markets. They were more flexible and adaptive. However, this flexibility came at a cost. White Tower locations were less consistent than White Castle locations. The customer experience varied more from one White Tower to another. The brand identity was less clear. The rise of new competitors. By the 1940s, both White Castle and White Tower faced a new reality. They were no longer alone in the fast food hamburger business. Their success had proven the model worked, and new competitors were emerging. Some of these new competitors were obvious imitators. Chains like White Tower Shops, Royal Castle, and Silver Castle, which copied the white building and castle/tower theme even more blatantly than White Tower had copied White Castle. But other competitors took different approaches. They learned from White Castle and White Tower but created their own distinct identities. On the West Coast, particularly in California, new hamburger chains were emerging with different models. These restaurants focused on drive-in service, where customers could order from their cars. They emphasized a more casual, car culture aesthetic rather than the fortress-like solidity of White Castle. The most significant of these new competitors would prove to be a small operation in San Bernardino, California, run by two brothers named Richard and Maurice McDonald. The McDonald brothers study White Castle. In 1937, Richard and Maurice McDonald opened a hot dog stand in Arcadia, California. By 1940, they had moved to San Bernardino and opened a drive-in restaurant called McDonald's Barbecue. It was successful, but the brothers were always looking to improve efficiency and increase profits. In 1948, they made a radical decision. They would completely restructure their operation. And to figure out how to do it, they studied White Castle intensively. The McDonald brothers didn't just read about White Castle. They traveled to White Castle locations, observed operations, took notes, and analyzed every aspect of the system. They saw what White Castle had pioneered: standardization, limited menu, assembly line production, focus on speed, emphasis on cleanliness, and low prices based on high volume. But the McDonald brothers also saw opportunities for improvement. White Castle's hamburgers were small, which meant customers often bought several. Why not make them slightly bigger so each hamburger was more satisfying? White Castle cooked on a flat griddle, which limited capacity. Why not use multiple grills and create separate stations for different tasks? When the McDonald brothers reopened their restructured restaurant in 1948, it was clearly based on White Castle's model but adapted for California car culture. They eliminated car hops and drive-in service, instead creating a simple walk-up window. They reduced their menu to just hamburgers, cheeseburgers, French fries, soft drinks, and milkshakes. They designed an assembly line kitchen that could produce food even faster than White Castle. And crucially, they created a distinctive architectural identity. Instead of castle turrets, they used golden arches. But the principle was the same: create a building so distinctive that it serves as its own advertisement. The McDonald brothers restaurant was a huge success. By the early 1950s, they were making enormous profits from their single location. Other entrepreneurs noticed and wanted to replicate the model. One of those entrepreneurs was a milkshake machine salesman named Ray Kroc. Ray Kroc and the franchising revolution. Ray Kroc visited the McDonald brothers restaurant in 1954 and immediately recognized its potential. But he saw something the McDonald brothers didn't. This model could be franchised nationally. The McDonald brothers had been reluctant to expand aggressively. They were making good money from their one location and didn't want the headaches of managing multiple restaurants. They had sold a few franchise licenses, but hadn't pursued expansion systematically. Kroc convinced them to let him become their franchising agent. In 1955, he opened the first franchised McDonald's in Des Plaines, Illinois, significantly in the Midwest, where White Castle had long dominated. Kroc's genius was understanding that franchising could achieve what White Castle had been trying to do: create a national chain with perfect consistency, but faster and with less capital. Instead of White Castle's model of owning every location, McDonald's would recruit franchisees who would invest their own money but follow McDonald's systems rigidly. Kroc studied White Castle's operations manual and created an even more detailed one for McDonald's. Every aspect of the restaurant was specified: how long to cook fries, what temperature to keep the fryer, how many pickles went on a hamburger, how to greet customers, what to say when taking orders, how often to clean the bathrooms. He created Hamburger University in 1961, a training facility where franchisees and managers learned the McDonald's system. This was White Castle's emphasis on training and standardization taken to a new level. McDonald's grew explosively. By 1960, there were over 200 McDonald's locations. By 1965, there were over 700. By 1970, there were nearly 1,500. White Castle, meanwhile, had fewer than 100 locations. White Castle's response: doubling down on quality. White Castle watched McDonald's rise with a mixture of admiration and frustration. They had pioneered the entire model, and now someone else was becoming wealthy by scaling it up with franchising. But Billy Ingram made a strategic decision. White Castle would not franchise. They would remain company-owned. This meant they would grow more slowly, but they would maintain complete control over quality. Ingram believed that franchising inevitably led to quality degradation. Franchisees cared primarily about profits, not about maintaining the brand's reputation. They would cut corners, use inferior ingredients, and gradually undermine what made the brand special. White Castle would be different. They would remain relatively small, but they would be the best. They would be the hamburger that people craved, the hamburger with a cult following, the hamburger that inspired fierce loyalty. To support this strategy, White Castle invested heavily in product development and quality control. They developed proprietary cooking equipment that no other chain could use. They created frozen hamburgers that could be sold in grocery stores, extending their brand without requiring new restaurants. They experimented with new menu items carefully, making sure each edition met their standards. They also cultivated their unique culture and history. White Castle embraced their role as the original, the pioneer, the hamburger that started it all. They celebrated their heritage and used it as a marketing tool. This strategy succeeded in creating intense brand loyalty. White Castle customers weren't just customers, they were fans, even fanatics. People would drive hours to visit a White Castle. They would order sliders by the dozens and freeze them at home. Harold and Kumar would make an entire movie about the lengths people would go to get White Castle. But this strategy also meant that White Castle remained a regional chain. If you didn't live in the Midwest or select East Coast areas, you might never experience White Castle. The company was beloved but limited in reach. White Tower's decline. White Tower, meanwhile, struggled to find its identity in the new fast food landscape. The fundamental problem was that White Tower had always been defined by its relationship to White Castle. They were the company like White Castle, the White Castle alternative, basically the same as White Castle. Their entire brand was built on similarity. But as the fast food industry evolved and new competitors emerged, similarity became a weakness rather than a strength. McDonald's, Burger King, founded 1954, and other chains had strong, distinct identities. They weren't copying anyone, they were their own thing. White Tower couldn't compete on originality because they weren't original. They couldn't compete on heritage because White Castle had more of it. They couldn't compete on cult status because their brand loyalty was weak. They couldn't compete on scale because McDonald's was expanding far faster through franchising. White Tower tried various strategies to differentiate itself. They experimented with menu additions. They tried remodeling restaurants with more modern designs. They attempted to rebrand and create a new identity. Nothing worked particularly well. Customers increasingly saw White Tower as outdated, a relic from an earlier era. When people wanted a fast hamburger, they went to McDonald's. When people wanted the authentic original experience, they went to White Castle. White Tower occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. By the 1960s, White Tower locations were closing. By the 1970s, the chain was in serious decline. By the 1980s, most White Towers had disappeared. A few locations persisted into the 1990s, but by the early 2000s, White Tower was essentially defunct. The company that had once been White Castle's greatest rival, the company that had sparked the first burger war, was gone. The evolution of fast food, 1960 to 1980. While White Castle persisted and White Tower declined, the fast food industry exploded into something far beyond what Billy Ingram and Walter Anderson could have imagined in 1921. McDonald's became a global empire. By 1968, they had opened their 1,000th location. By 1972, they had opened their 2,000th. They expanded internationally, with locations in Canada, Japan, Germany, and eventually nearly every country on Earth. The Golden Arches became one of the most recognized symbols in human history. Burger King grew into McDonald's primary competitor, differentiating itself with flame-broiled burgers and the have-it-your-way customization promise. Wendy's entered the market in 1969, focusing on fresh, never-frozen beef and square patties, a nod to White Castle squares, perhaps. Kentucky Fried Chicken, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, and dozens of other chains proved that the fast food model worked for every type of food, not just hamburgers. The model White Castle had pioneered, standardization, speed, cleanliness, low prices, distinctive branding, assembly line production, was applied to chicken, Mexican food, pizza, roast beef, and everything else. The drive-thru became standard, adapting the model for America's car-dependent culture. McDonald's added drive-thru windows in 1975, and soon every fast food chain had them. Franchising became the dominant growth strategy. Instead of companies owning all locations, they recruited entrepreneurs who invested their own capital but followed corporate systems. This allowed explosive growth with minimal corporate investment. Marketing became increasingly sophisticated. Fast food chains advertised heavily on television, created memorable characters and slogans, and built powerful brands that appealed to children and adults alike. The nutritional and public health implications of fast food became increasingly apparent. By the 1970s and 1980s, nutritionists and doctors were warning about the health consequences of regularly eating high-calorie, high-fat, high-sodium fast food. But this did little to slow the industry's growth. White Castle's cult status. Through all these changes, White Castle persisted as a unique phenomenon in the fast food landscape. They remained relatively small. By 2000, they had only about 375 locations, compared to McDonald's tens of thousands. But they had something McDonald's couldn't easily replicate: authenticity and cult status. White Castle became a regional treasure in the areas where they operated. People who grew up near White Castles often developed lifelong cravings for sliders. People who moved away would make pilgrimages back home just to visit White Castle. The hamburgers became comfort food, nostalgia food, food tied to identity and memory. Part of this cult status came from White Castle's resistance to change. While other chains constantly modified their menus, their restaurants, and their branding to stay current, White Castle remained deliberately old-fashioned. Their buildings still looked like castles. Their hamburgers were still small, square, and cooked on onions with 5 holes. Their prices remained remarkably low. This consistency became a form of time travel. Eating at White Castle in 2000 wasn't radically different from eating there in 1960, 1940, or even 1925. In a world of constant change, White Castle offered continuity. The company also benefited from unexpected cultural moments. The 2004 movie Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle introduced the chain to a new generation and turned it into a pop culture icon. The movie's entire plot revolved around 2 friends' quest to satisfy their White Castle craving, and it was filmed with genuine affection for the chain. White Castle embraced their cult status. They sold merchandise, t-shirts, coffee mugs, even candles that smelled like their hamburgers. They created a romance package for Valentine's Day where couples could make reservations for table service at White Castle. They leaned into their quirky, beloved status. Part 6. They didn't see it coming: the irony of victory and defeat. Looking back from the 21st century, the White Castle versus White Tower saga is filled with ironies and unexpected outcomes. White Castle won the legal battle, more or less. They established important precedents about trade dress and brand protection. They forced White Tower to make modifications. They protected their name and their specific innovations. But White Tower won some battles too. They proved that the fast food model couldn't be monopolized by one company. They established the principle that similar businesses could coexist. They opened markets and demonstrated demand that later benefited everyone, including White Castle. Yet both companies ultimately lost, in a sense. Neither became the dominant force in the industry they helped create. That honor went to McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, and other chains that came later. White Castle remained small and regional, beloved but limited. White Tower eventually disappeared entirely. The companies that succeeded at scale were the ones that learned from both White Castle and White Tower but created their own distinct identities and, crucially, adopted franchising. What they didn't see coming. On June 3, 1921, when Billy Ingram and Walter Anderson opened that first White Castle in Wichita, they were trying to solve a simple problem: how to make hamburgers respectable and profitable. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams at solving that problem. But they couldn't have foreseen what would follow. The global scale. They imagined a successful regional chain, perhaps even a national chain. They couldn't have imagined an industry that would eventually serve billions of hamburgers annually across every continent. An industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The cultural transformation. They were selling food. They didn't realize they were transforming American culture and eventually global culture. The concepts of speed, convenience, standardization, and low cost would reshape not just restaurants but retail, entertainment, services, and nearly every aspect of modern life. The health crisis. They were making hamburgers cleaner and safer, solving the food poisoning problem that had plagued hamburgers for decades. They couldn't have foreseen that fast food would later be blamed for epidemics of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and other health problems. The food they made safe, they also made ubiquitous. Too ubiquitous, some would argue. The labor model. They created a system of efficient, low-skilled labor that could produce consistent results. They couldn't have foreseen that this would become a model for an entire category of McJobs, low-wage, limited-benefit employment that would define work for millions of people while creating few pathways to advancement. The legal frameworks. They thought they were suing one imitator. They were actually forcing the development of an entire body of law around intellectual property, trade dress, and brand protection that would affect every business in America. The environmental impact. They were focused on cleanliness and efficiency. They didn't consider the environmental consequences of disposable packaging, industrial-scale meat production, supply chain logistics, and energy-intensive operations replicated tens of thousands of times. The franchise revolution. Ingram's decision not to franchise made sense for quality control. But it meant White Castle couldn't achieve the scale that franchising made possible. The franchise model would create more millionaires and distribute more wealth than White Castle's company-owned model, even as it also created quality control challenges. The end of regional cuisine. They were making hamburgers accessible. They were inadvertently contributing to the homogenization of American cuisine and eventually global cuisine. The rise of chains would mean that increasingly, every place looked and tasted like every other place. The speed of imitation. They knew White Tower had copied them, but they couldn't have anticipated how quickly and thoroughly every aspect of a successful business model would be copied in the modern era. They pioneered, and within 5 years someone had replicated everything. This would become a defining feature of American capitalism. The power of branding. They chose the name White Castle thoughtfully, but they couldn't have fully understood how powerful branding would become in the 20th century. Brands would become more valuable than physical assets, more important than products themselves. The Golden Arches would eventually be worth more than all of McDonald's real estate combined. The pattern they established. The White Castle versus White Tower story established a pattern that would repeat throughout American business history. Phase 1. Innovation. Someone creates something genuinely new and takes significant risk in doing so. Phase 2. Success. The innovation proves profitable, catching the attention of entrepreneurs and investors. Phase 3. Imitation. Others copy the model, often quickly and with minimal changes, benefiting from the innovator's work without bearing the initial risk. Phase 4. Legal battle. The innovator tries to protect what they've built through lawsuits, trademark claims, and patents. Phase 5. Legal evolution. Courts struggle with where to draw lines between legitimate competition and unfair copying, gradually developing new legal principles. Phase 6. Market evolution. Multiple competitors emerge, some copying, some innovating on the original model. The market fragments. Phase 7. Unexpected victor. Often, neither the original innovator nor the imitator ends up dominating long-term. Instead, a third party who learned from both but added their own innovations achieves the greatest success. This pattern would play out with personal computers. Apple innovated, many copied, Microsoft dominated. Smartphones, many tried, Apple succeeded, now everyone competes. Social media, Friendster innovated, MySpace succeeded briefly, Facebook dominated, and countless other industries. White Castle and White Tower were the template. The questions that persist. The White Castle-White Tower saga asks questions that American capitalism still hasn't fully answered. What do we owe to pioneers? Should companies that take risks and create new markets get special protection? Or does the free market mean that successful innovations should be immediately available for anyone to copy? Where's the line between inspiration and theft? Every business learns from successful predecessors. But when does learning become copying? When does copying become theft? How do we balance innovation incentives with competition benefits? If pioneers get too much protection, it stifles competition and hurts consumers. If they get too little protection, it reduces incentives to innovate. Where's the right balance? Does success have a moral dimension? White Tower succeeded by copying. McDonald succeeded by learning from both White Castle and others. Is there a moral difference between these paths to success? Should there be? What happens to industries after the pioneers? Often, the companies that invent entire industries don't end up dominating those industries. Should we care? Is this a failure of the pioneers, or simply how markets work? Part 7. The Legacy, 1980-present. White Castle today. As of 2025, White Castle still operates. The company remains privately held by the Ingram family, now in its 4th generation of family ownership. They have around 350 locations, primarily in the Midwest and parts of the East Coast. By any normal business measure, White Castle is successful. They're profitable. They have devoted customers. They're stable and sustainable. They continue to innovate within their niche. They were early adopters of Impossible Burgers and plant-based options, for instance. But measured against the industry they created, White Castle is tiny. McDonald's alone has over 40,000 locations worldwide. The entire fast food industry serves tens of millions of people daily and generates hundreds of billions in annual revenue. White Castle's decision not to franchise, to grow slowly, to prioritize control over scale, these decisions ensured quality and consistency but limited reach. It's impossible to say they were wrong. Exactly. They created a beloved brand with loyal customers. Many family businesses would envy their longevity and profitability. But it's also impossible not to wonder what might have been. If White Castle had franchised aggressively in the 1950s, could they have become what McDonald's became? Would we live in a world where White Castle-shaped buildings with turrets were ubiquitous on every highway, in every country? The lessons for business. Business schools study the White Castle-White Tower case, and business leaders continue to grapple with the lessons. First-mover advantage is real but limited. White Castle's pioneer status gave them valuable brand recognition and customer loyalty. But it didn't prevent competition, and it didn't guarantee long-term dominance. Being first matters, but it's not everything. Imitation is a viable strategy, but risky. White Tower succeeded for decades by copying White Castle. But their lack of distinct identity eventually became a fatal weakness. Imitation can help you get started, but you eventually need to become something beyond a copy. Protection of intellectual property is crucial but complicated. White Castle was right to fight to protect their brand. But the legal system's inability to fully protect their entire business model wasn't necessarily wrong. The challenge is finding the right balance. Scale matters enormously in commodity businesses. Hamburgers are largely commodities. One burger is much like another. In commodity businesses, scale provides enormous advantages in purchasing, distribution, marketing, and profitability. White Castle's choice to stay relatively small meant they could never achieve these scale advantages. Brand loyalty can compensate for limited scale. White Castle proved that a smaller, regionally focused company with intense brand loyalty can survive and even thrive alongside much larger competitors. You don't have to be the biggest to be successful. Franchising enables rapid growth but requires giving up control. McDonald's explosive growth was possible because of franchising. But franchising meant Ray Kroc and later McDonald's executives had to constantly fight to maintain quality and consistency across thousands of locations owned by independent operators. White Castle avoided those battles but paid the price in limited growth. Innovation requires continuous reinvestment. White Castle didn't stop innovating after 1921. They continually improved their operations, developed proprietary equipment, and adapted to changing markets. But they were always innovating within their existing model, never truly disrupting themselves. Sometimes survival requires more radical reinvention. The lessons for law. The White Castle-White Tower legal battles contributed to the development of important legal concepts. Trade dress protection. Thanks partly to this case and others like it, American law now recognizes that the overall appearance and feel of a product or business can be protected, not just specific trademarks and patents. This protects innovation while still allowing competition. Functionality doctrine. Courts developed clearer standards for distinguishing between functional elements, which anyone should be able to use, and distinctive design elements, which can be protected. If something is functional, it generally can't be monopolized. If it's purely ornamental or brand identifying, it might be protected. Consumer confusion test. Modern trademark law focuses heavily on whether consumers are likely to be confused about the source of a product or service. This emerged from cases like White Castle versus White Tower, where the central question was whether customers thought they were getting White Castle when they were actually at White Tower. Balancing innovation and competition. The legal system has tried to find a balance between protecting innovators, to encourage innovation, and allowing competition, to benefit consumers. This balance is constantly being renegotiated, but cases like White Castle versus White Tower helped establish the framework. The cultural legacy. Beyond business and law, White Castle and its rivalry with White Tower left a cultural legacy. They helped establish the hamburger as an American icon. Before White Castle, hamburgers were lower-class food, suspicious and disreputable. White Castle made them respectable, then ubiquitous, and eventually iconic. The hamburger became a symbol of America itself, fast, democratic, affordable, and available to everyone. They pioneered the concept of fast food as a category. Before White Castle, there were restaurants and there were street vendors, but there wasn't really a concept of fast food as a distinct type of dining. White Castle created the category and defined its characteristics: speed, standardization, cleanliness, affordability, convenience. They demonstrated the power of systems thinking in service businesses. White Castle approached hamburger making as an engineering problem. How do you create perfect consistency? How do you maximize speed? How do you ensure quality? This systems thinking approach would become standard across the service sector. They showed how architecture could be branding. The White Castle building wasn't just a restaurant. It was a three-dimensional advertisement, a brand symbol, and a promise all in one. This concept of the building as brand would influence everything from McDonald's golden arches to Apple's distinctive retail stores. They proved that low-end products could be big business. Before White Castle, most business attention focused on luxury goods and services for wealthy customers. White Castle showed that there was enormous profit potential in serving working-class customers with affordable products, if you could achieve sufficient volume. This insight would drive the development of mass-market consumer culture. The human stories. Behind all the business strategy, legal battles, and cultural impact were human beings making decisions, taking risks, and dealing with consequences. Billy Ingram lived until 1966, long enough to see White Castle become an institution and to watch McDonald's surpass them. One wonders what he felt, watching the company he founded become famous while remaining small, as other companies built empires using the model he had pioneered. Did he regret not franchising? Or was he proud of maintaining quality and control? We'll never know for certain, but those who knew him said he remained convinced until the end that White Castle's approach was right. Walter Anderson sold his stake in the company in 1933, during the Depression, and largely disappeared from the White Castle story. The cook who had perfected the hamburger-making system, whose obsession with quality had started everything, left the company he co-founded and faded into obscurity. He died in 1963, largely forgotten. John E. Sachs, White Tower's founder, died in 1940, before his company's eventual decline. He never had to watch White Tower slowly disappear. His son Thomas continued running the company for decades, fighting to keep it relevant as the market changed around them. Ray Kroc became fabulously wealthy from McDonald's and died in 1984 as an American business legend. But he always acknowledged that he hadn't invented the McDonald system. The McDonald brothers had. He had simply seen its potential and scaled it up. The McDonald brothers sold their rights to Ray Kroc for $2.7 million in 1961. It seemed like a lot of money at the time. But McDonald's would eventually be worth billions. The brothers watched from the sidelines as their creation became a global empire, knowing they had been compensated but perhaps never truly rewarded for what they had built. These human stories remind us that behind every business success and failure are people. People who take risks, make decisions with imperfect information, and live with consequences they couldn't have predicted. The unanswered what-ifs. History happened one way, but we can't help wondering about the alternatives. What if White Castle had franchised aggressively in the 1940s and 1950s? Would they have become the dominant global fast food chain instead of McDonald's? Would their slower, more quality-focused approach have worked at massive scale, or would franchising have inevitably degraded the brand? What if the courts had ruled decisively in White Castle's favor, preventing White Tower from operating? Would that have prevented other competitors from entering the market? Would it have slowed the development of the fast food industry? Or would entrepreneurs have simply found other ways around White Castle's protections? What if White Tower had focused on differentiation instead of imitation from the beginning? Could they have built a lasting brand as a legitimate alternative to White Castle rather than a copy? Or was the fast food market not ready for multiple distinct hamburger chains in the 1920s? What if the McDonald brothers had opened their restaurant in the Midwest instead of California? Would they have been able to develop their improved system with White Castle locations nearby providing constant comparison? Or would White Castle's presence have made it harder for them to differentiate? What if health concerns about fast food had emerged earlier? If the public health community had recognized the long-term consequences of regular fast food consumption in the 1950s instead of the 1980s, would the industry have developed differently? Would companies have been forced to offer healthier options from the beginning? These what-ifs are unanswerable, but they remind us that history is contingent. Small differences in timing, decisions, or circumstances can lead to radically different outcomes. Epilogue. June 3, 2025, 104 years later. It's been 104 years since Billy Ingram and Walter Anderson opened that first White Castle in Wichita. The building itself is long gone, demolished decades ago. But the company survives, still serving sliders cooked with onions through 5 holes, still in white buildings with turrets. White Tower is gone, remembered primarily in legal textbooks and by nostalgic historians who study business history. The last White Tower locations closed in the 2000s. A few of the buildings survive, repurposed for other uses, their turrets now selling Chinese food or insurance or nothing at all. But the legacy of both companies, and their rivalry, is everywhere. Every time you drive past a McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, or any other fast food restaurant, you're seeing the descendants of White Castle's innovation. The standardization, the speed, the cleanliness, the distinctive architecture, the assembly line production. All of it traces back to that June day in 1921. Every time a company sues another for copying its look and feel, they're relying on legal principles that emerged from the White Castle-White Tower battles. The concept that you can protect not just your name but your overall brand appearance, that's part of their legacy. Every time an entrepreneur studies a successful business model and thinks, I could do that too, they're participating in the same dynamic that created White Tower. The tension between learning from success and outright copying, between legitimate competition and unfair imitation. That tension is fundamental to capitalism and was crystallized in the burger wars. Every time a company decides whether to franchise or remain company-owned, they're facing the same choice Billy Ingram faced. The trade-off between growth and control, between scale and quality, that dilemma hasn't changed. The fast food industry today is massive, global, and still evolving. It employs millions, feeds billions, and generates hundreds of billions in revenue. It faces challenges from health advocates, labor activists, environmental groups, and changing consumer preferences. It's experimenting with automation, plant-based alternatives, delivery services, and new business models. But all of it, every last bit of it, started with 2 men in Wichita who wanted to make hamburgers respectable. They didn't see what was coming. They couldn't have. They were trying to solve a simple problem: how to sell clean, safe hamburgers for a nickel. They succeeded at that. But in succeeding, they created something far larger than they imagined. They sparked rivalries they didn't anticipate. They raised legal questions that took decades to answer. They established business patterns that would repeat across industries. They transformed American culture and eventually global culture. They changed how humanity eats. And perhaps most ironically, they built a company that would remain relatively small while the industry they created became enormous. The pioneers were surpassed by the settlers, who were surpassed by later arrivals who learned from everyone who came before. That's perhaps the deepest lesson. Innovation matters, but innovation alone doesn't guarantee dominance. Being first gives you advantages, but those advantages are temporary and limited. Success comes not just from creating something new, but from executing well over time, adapting to changing circumstances, and sometimes making hard choices between growth and control, scale and quality, innovation and imitation. White Castle and White Tower fought the first burger war. Neither ultimately won in the sense of becoming the dominant global empire. But both left legacies that persist. The next time you grab a quick burger, whether from White Castle, McDonald's, Burger King, or any of the thousands of hamburger restaurants that now exist worldwide, remember June 3, 1921. Remember the 2 men who opened a tiny white building in Wichita. Remember the imitator who sparked the first burger war. Remember that they didn't see it coming. Nobody could have. They just wanted to sell hamburgers. They changed the world instead.